Welcome to our Together on Mission podcast, brought to you by the Baptist Union of Victoria and hosted by our Director of Mission and Ministries, Reverend Daniel Bullock. Daniel will be joined by a guest from our Victorian Baptist family each week for a brief discussion that aims to encourage you in your personal walk of faith and give you some practical suggestions that you can implement through your week. Throughout this year, the podcast will be focusing on the theme of being and sharing the good news. For the next few episodes, Daniel will be joined by Reverend Troy Arnott, Senior Pastor at New Community Church in Melbourne's East. Troy has an interest in the application of the good news in our cultural landscape. He planted New Community 22 years ago and has been pastoring the church ever since, along with a fantastic team. Troy completed a master's degree at the University of St Andrews in Scotland under Tom Wright and Alan Torrance in 2019, and is currently undertaking doctoral research in Mark's Gospel. Troy is married to Bronwyn, has 3 adult children, and for recreation enjoys fly fishing for large brown trout in mountain streams. So now let's welcome Daniel and Troy.
Well, welcome back to our podcast. In the last couple of weeks, Troy and I have been reflecting on the elusiveness of peace, yet the call to be a people of peace. Last week, I juxtaposed the idea of God as a God of peace with the contrasting metaphor of God as a warrior, and we discuss what that might mean for us in our battle of life and faith. This week, I'm shifting gears and reflecting on Christ's return. But before I do that, I want to welcome back Troy. It's been great having Troy with us, share over the past couple of weeks. And before we jump into today's reflection, I was wondering, Troy, if you could reflect on the time you spent in Scotland a few years ago that you referred to last week under NT, right? And who was the other fellow that you
Alan Torrance.
Alan Torrance. So just reflect on that time, because that was a unique period of time, away from your church, away from your family, and really immersing yourself in deep study. So I'd be interested if you could reflect on that time and how that impacted on you and others, and maybe even your church.
Yeah. Well, could you imagine you're 50 years old. I turned 50 over there. It was a quiet day. No one else knew me, so I had to go over and make friends again. But the average age of the person I was studying with was probably in the mid-20s. And so I kind of, to integrate myself, I didn't behave exactly like a 25-year-old, but there was a lot of spring in the step when you didn't have the same responsibilities, but different kinds of, so it exercised a different part of your brain and your life. But it was also for that 10 months being over there was just a wonderful opportunity to reflect. I probably went over there with the goal to say I'd really like to reflect upon the next stages of life, and realise probably week 3 I need to make a decision here. Am I going to dive in boots and all, because the program was an MLit, warranted my full attention. Mm-hmm. So any ideas or aspirations or dreamlike stakes I had of going over there and having a really contemplative time was just shot out of the water. I had to exercise writing habits and techniques and research and study habits that I hadn't done for 20 years as a pastor. So that was a real stretch for me, Daniel, a real stretch. And so another time with leaning into God. Of course, it's also the home of golf, I've got to say. Yeah. And so just for any golfers out there, I'm sorry, but it's true. For £100, I could play on any of the 6 courses, 4 of them. And if I got my handicap, I could actually play on the old and the new, and I did. And so in between study breaks, I started off at the Belgrove, there's the simplest 9-hole, and worked my way up. And I think I got to play in the old course about 4 times. It was amazing. You should have seen me the first tee off I had on that old course right in front of the RNA. I sweated about that tee off shot. Any golfers out there, you will understand exactly what I mean. I sweated over that drive for a whole week beforehand, but I made the drive. That was good. The next shot was really ordinary, but it's a great time, Wayne.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, good on you, Troy. We'll hear a little more about from you a bit later. A few years back, you talked about NT, right? He wrote a book that it was entitled "Surprised by Hope."
That's true.
Rightly, I think, picking up on the meta theme of hope, which is a foundation principle for Christianity. One of the great hopes we have as Christians is that one day Jesus will return. He will come again. This idea of Jesus' second coming is fundamental to Christian belief. But it's a tricky subject to talk about because so many of us have different ideas and have adopted different theories about Jesus' return. Some go as far as to come up with dates and timelines as to when this great event will actually occur. While there may be disagreement on what the second coming might look like or when it will happen, I think we Christians all agree that our fundamental hope in the second coming is that our true Saviour, the resurrected Jesus, our true Lord, will return to earth and change everything. He will right all the wrongs of this world. He will transform the entire world so that it is full of his life, love, glory, and power for all to see. The second coming is to be a day where heaven will come to earth and restore creation, heal people, unite the righteous, both the living and the dead, and make all things new. Because of this great hope we have in the second coming, it is natural for us to want this to happen as soon as possible. But I think we need to be careful about what we wish for. Jesus himself said that no one knows the day or the hour this will occur. So we need to always be ready and on guard and keep watch. In other words, Jesus basically says that we shouldn't be obsessed with when he will return, but instead make sure we are ready regardless of when it happens. Being ready is about living the life God intended us to live, a life of discipleship, of following the ways of Jesus, of love, compassion, mercy, justice, and forgiveness. Displaying the fruit of the Spirit in our lives, helping the poor and lifting up the downtrodden. Our hope in the second coming should primarily affect the way we live out our lives. This idea of Jesus' second coming is sometimes referred to as the day of the Lord. And the Hebrews in the Old Testament had a similar hope, except their hope for the day of the Lord was for a return of God to gloriously reign supreme over the sovereign nation of Israel, a time when all enemies were banished and the people prospered. This was especially true in the 8th century BC, but it's interesting that the Hebrew prophets of that time also warned the Israelites to be careful about what they wished for. As I've already mentioned, the Israelites in the 8th century BC longed for the day of the Lord. To this end, the Israelites fulfilled their religious obligations. They gave their tithe and more. They gathered and worshipped. They followed all the required religious observances. They believed that if they ticked the religious boxes required of them, all would be fine for them on the day of the Lord. So they did all the right things. So what was the problem? Well, they did all these religious duties with the wrong motive, without a devoted heart, and with a self-serving, self-seeking agenda. Instead of loving one another, caring for the poor, living upright and wholesome lives, they neglected justice, mercy, and righteousness. What's more, alongside their religious observances and duties, they followed and worshipped pagan gods, set up idols, and generally treated God as if he was one of many gods. So through the prophets, God basically says to them, I've had enough of your two-faced pseudo-devotion. I've had enough of your self-serving attitudes. I've had enough of your hard hearts. I've had enough of your hypocrisy. I require justice and mercy. I require 100% devotion and have given you plenty of time and motivation to comply. You say you long for the day of the Lord, but that day will not be as you expect. It will come, but instead of joy, it will bring you pain, suffering, and judgment. It will bring you exile and death. Well, that's a pretty dark picture, but I think it can help us a little to understand what God requires of us as we wait for his return. In order to be ready for Jesus' return, we are invited to, firstly, an authentic relationship where he does not want us to adhere to religious observance, but connect deeply with him in and through our devotion and worship. God despises the gods of our own making and calls us to repentance. This includes the worship of our own making. For those who lead congregations in worship, please understand that this ministry is a high calling. You are to lead people into engagement with the living God. Your task is to help people shift their devotion from the desires and wants of this age to the desires and wants of our Lord. You are not rock stars performing for the applause of the congregation, but worshippers helping others understand that they are on holy ground. Sometimes we congregational members critique worship as if it's about us and what we get out of it. True worship is not about us, it's about God. It's about honouring him, glorifying him, expressing need, hope, faith, and love to him. Sometimes our motives as we come to worship God needs adjusting. We skip the songs, the prayers, the community life so we can get to the message, as if more knowledge is required instead of more devotion. Secondly, Another aspect of being ready is the pursuit of justice and righteousness, mercy and grace as we live out our life and faith. Concern and compassion for the poor, the ill, the marginalised are not optional extras, but the outflow of authentic faith in him. We all long for the day of the Lord, but we need to be careful what we wish for. Instead of longing for this day, may we simply make sure we're ready for it. So, Troy, what comments or insights or questions do you have regarding this concept of being ready for Christ's return?
Yeah, lots to think on there, Daniel. Thank you. If I make two initial comments, I'm told that if you ask a rabbi, and it's probably which rabbi, what was the cause of the destruction of the first temple, and they'd say idolatry, the sin of idolatry. And the second, the destruction of the second temple, what was the cause of that is because of unmitigated violence. In other words, the certain pockets in Israel turning inwardly on one another, and violence was the reason why he allowed the destruction of the temple. The second comment just make is that about worship is that human beings, I think we've come to realise human beings are made to worship. Mm-hmm. It's just a fundamental. And if we don't, we become what we worship. Yep. And so if we worship money, sooner or later you will start to rank and order people, evaluate them according to their monetary value or worth. Mm-hmm. If we worship status, we'll begin to form our own social hierarchy about who are the important ones and who are not. And so I think if we come to terms with when a human being worships the one true living God, they're remade in that God's image. And I think that might give some understanding of what's going on there. And in Acts 2, the Spirit comes and they speak in tongues and languages and foreign languages that they hadn't learned before. And it says that they were speaking in terms of praise to God. And I think that's one of the first things that happens when someone becomes a person of faith or follows Jesus, is he puts a new song in them, and it's redirected worship towards the living God. The reason why I think that's an important thing to think of is from that book that you referred to, and if anyone's out there and you haven't read it, it's a heavy good read. Yep. But I would encourage you to do it. Surprised by Hope. Two ideas that really resonated with me through that, many, but here's just two I've sort of plucked from it. Is firstly, as the title says, hope. Tom Wright spends a fair bit of time on Romans 8. If there's one chapter in the Bible that it's one of the go-tos, it's got to be Romans 8. And as you read through that entire chapter, it's as though Paul's describing creation on its tippy toes, longing and awaiting for the time in which the Creator God would actually put to right the wrongs. And it perceives the human beings as being the first fruits of, if you have a first fruits, it means you can have a second fruits as well. And a third fruits and a fourth fruits. And so it looks, if you like, the creation looks at those human beings that are being restored in God's image, and they say, if the recreation has begun with them, we're next. Mm-hmm. And so it's this wonderful imagery of the creation groaning and longing to be liberated from its decay and its oppression. And so it's a wonderful passage. And I think one of the great things that we can take away from that Romans 8 passage is, perhaps as I mentioned last week, matters to God. Mm-hmm. And so if you've grown up with an understanding of the good news of Jesus being a disembodied soul state in an otherworldly space, we haven't read our Bibles more fully enough. If you jump to Revelation 21, it's clearly there's a new heavens and a new earth, the bride returning to earth. And so if you like, the consummation of heaven and earth coming back together, and just like it was with Adam and Eve, that overlapping two spheres. And so you have to have a theology of understanding that matter does matter to God. Mm-hmm. And that means stop splitting humans into souls and bodies. You need to see them as wholes. And I think when we do that, we shift something within ourselves. So that's the first idea. The second idea that really resonates through that book, Surprised by Hope, is the idea of having a vocation. And Tom Wright describes it like this. He says, I want you to think of yourselves as being an angled mirror. And the purpose of human beings is to reflect God's goodness and his life and his order into the chaos of the world, and partner with him in bringing order to disorder. And in return, the creation then is supposed to, human beings are sum up to the praises of creation and reflect them back to the Maker God. And that sort of has this image then of a two-way multi-purpose. But the thing that jumps out at me, and I think was a fresh idea, is the idea of God having a vocation for us. So the way in which we think about that at New Community is we've got this little catchphrase that says, we're here to partner with God in transforming his world until he returns and completes the job. And so we see ourselves in that idea of Jesus' return as now not twiddling our thumbs and waiting for that to happen, but rather we see ourselves as foretastes, little micro communities of kingdom communities of what's coming. And so therefore our sense of Christ's return is to think about, am I living out that kingdom life here on earth, so that perhaps when he comes he might utter the words, well done, good and faithful servant. There's a passage in 1 Corinthians 15. It's just a throwaway sentence, but it just seems to sum up everything that Paul's written beforehand. I'll just read it out for us. It's 1 Corinthians 15:58, and he finishes off this long sort of chapter with these words: "Therefore, my beloved, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the work of the Lord, because you know that in the Lord your labour is not in vain." As Tom Wright reflects on that, it's kind of this idea of a tapestry, and every cup of water, every kind word, every creative act of beauty, every pointing to the truthfulness of who you discover Jesus is, every act of justice and mercy will not be lost in God's recreation. He is going to somehow gather it all up. Every little act of kindness and deed and truthfulness shared will actually not be lost in God's eyes, and somehow it'll all be caught up in God's recreative act at the end of the age. And so that gives me a great sense of partnership. We're not building God's kingdom. That was a mistake that the social gospel is at the turn of the century fell into. We can actually bring about God's kingdom of heaven. Then came World War I. How devastating. But we can actually partner with God in small ways in what he's doing and already doing and will do one day.
Yeah, well, I don't need to ask my next question, because in many ways you've answered that. But what I'm hearing is saying that really, if we live a life in light of that Christ is going to come back, we live a life of serving, of discipleship, of righteousness, of looking at how our life can impact this creation and other people, it will make a difference. It will make a difference. Is there anything else you want to add in relation to how Christ's return impacts on our living and sharing and being the good news?
Well, there's this little story, and I'm not sure if it's quite accurate, but I think the bones of it are of Mother Teresa doing her work one day and going around individually caring for the poor and the needy. There was a journalist who'd been tracking with her for a few days and getting increasingly frustrated because she realised that Mother Teresa's going so slow, she's individually attending to people. And I think she must have blurted out something to the effect of, you could be so much more successful if you just did it this way and actually, went and worked somewhere else. To which apparently Mother Teresa turned around and looked her in the eye and said, God did not call me to be successful, he called me to be faithful. And I think that if we take that idea from Mother Teresa, which would have been very striking and very challenging for people, is that we need to redefine what success looks like, not defined by what the kingdoms of the earth say, but what by the kingdoms of the heavens say. Yeah. And so if we do that, we need to begin to tune our ears to one set of hands clapping in the heavenlies about the way in which we're living our lives, instead of taking direction from Hollywood.
Yeah, that's good. Fantastic, Troy. Life matters. Our life and other people's life, and we can make a difference in this world by living the life that God intended us to live. May that be something that resonates with you, and until next week, may you experience the blessings of God.